to understand the feminist movement in the 20th and 21st century, we have to understand where it's coming from. It didn't come out of nowhere. You know, you look at the emergence, for example, of communism in Russia. It didn't come out of nowhere. There's a reason why it happened in Russia and not in another country. And it happened in Russia and not in another country because in Russia and in China, the serf and peasant class were so oppressed by the aristocracy in both of those countries, and they had been for so long, that they were desperate and they were hungry and they were tired and they were fed up with the status quo, and so they were willing to make a dramatic change that resulted in a lot of bloodshed. And so I think when we look at in the 20th century, we saw these huge forces emerge, huge revolutionary forces with communism, with feminism, with a lot of movements, but we can't understand them in a vacuum. We have to understand them in their sort of world historical perspective. And so when we zoom out and we get this intuitive understanding of world history through the Middle Ages and even pre-Middle Ages, during the sort of Greek times and in other civilizations, the Persian Empire, which preceded the Middle Ages, all of these things, we can start to understand how the pendulum naturally wants to find its own balance in world history. And so if women have been mistreated and oppressed through violence and other means, as I think they have been quite generally through all over the planet for thousands of years, then that shift, that pendulum, which got very, very out of balance between men and women, is now seeking to harmonize itself by going in the other direction. And so, in my opinion, the feminist movement becomes sometimes discriminatory against men. There can be a lot of negative emotions behind the feminist movement, especially in its more academic and intellectual manifestations. And so I think you could characterize it somewhat, not always, but somewhat by man-hating. And so the reaction to that is, well, feminism is way off the hook, at least in its more extreme elements. But when we look at the history of it, it starts to make sense. I'm not saying it's always right in its extreme manifestations, but it starts to make sense because women have been on the receiving end of a lot of violence for a long time and a lot of oppression. They haven't been able to take their place in society. Many times they were relegated to roles in the house, raising children. They weren't given a voice. They weren't given representation politically. And this is the same for like minorities in the US, which only recently started getting equal rights and things like that politically and in society. And so there, of course, is a lashback. There, of course, is a period which we are in, a tumultuous period, where these huge sort of titanic forces and tectonic plates are trying to compensate for what has preceded them. And so when we see sort of the feminist movement in that vein and from that perspective, it makes sense. Because it's a reaction. It's simply a reaction to the violence and oppression women have experienced for so long, all over the world, in almost every society. Not every woman, not every man was an oppressor. Many were kind, many were good. But in general, when we look at society as a whole, we can say that is true. And I think that has been true in every major civilization that I know of, at least, for the last few thousand years. But when we then go from that conclusion to what we have right now, which is this lashback, this blowback from the oppression and violence, to now sort of this emotional discrimination sometimes against men, we can say, okay, that's a natural balancing act, but at the same time, that's not going to fix the problem. Because ultimately what we want is male and female to live in harmony. And not just the physical bodies, not just the sort of genders, but the energies of the feminine and the masculine to sort of reinforce each other and strengthen each other rather than oppose and fight each other, which is what we've seen for a long time. And so men maybe are scared of being more feminine. They're scared of expressing their feminine aspects. At least they have been for a long time. Now in modern society, men are becoming quite feminine, at least in the US and maybe Western Europe. But I think pop culture sort of encourages that. We see this image of a sort of effeminate man is projected all over, and it's popularized through pop culture, through actors, through musicians, and we see that as, okay, that's cool, but that is also a sort of reaction to this thousands of years of men not being able to incorporate their own feminine energy and quality into their person, and their personality. And likewise with women, they weren't able to be empowered. They weren't able to find their masculine energy, their sort of freedom of speech, their ability to express themselves, their ability to project themselves into the world, which is more of a masculine quality. And so when we start looking at it like this, we see it really has nothing to do with gender at all. It has to do with the sort of archetypal energies of male and female that each gender has and is supposed to balance within themselves. And in relationship, that's one of the main things that's supposed to come out of that. A man is supposed to help a woman find her confidence, her strength, and to be a protector of that energy, that sort of sensitive, nurturing energy, because it's more vulnerable to violent forces in the world, as we've seen through history. And for a man, a woman is supposed to help them find their sensitivity, their compassion, their intuition, and to listen to that and to encourage that to come out so that both genders can be balanced in themselves and express both male and female qualities in their being.